Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Harm Reduction Task Force Q&A panel. Today, we'll be discussing the intersection between harm reduction and diversity, equity, and inclusion. I am your moderator, Carrie Leonard, and we will be discussing all the intersectionality here. So let's do some introductions. Roy, let's start with you.
Hi, I'm Roy Gardner. I'm case manager at the People Concerned. My site is the Alexandria.
My name is Erica. I work at Cloverfield and previously the Village.
Hi, I'm Bowie. I am the director over San Michelle Interim Housing Project.
All right, so the first question, and don't mind me, I have my notes for the questions. How does harm reduction and diversity, equity, and inclusion intersect? So, and how are they related?
Okay, so I'll start with that. So harm reduction and diversity, equity, and inclusion intersect. When you think about harm reduction, oftentimes people zoom in on substances, but it could also be other things that clients need assistance with in reducing something that can cause harm to them. So they could also include sex work, and so on and so forth. And when we think about substances as well as sex work, the harm isn't in just, being a sex worker or using substances. The harm also come from external forces as well. So when you bring in the diversity, equity, inclusion portion of it, how it intersects is oftentimes when there's a negative impact of substances. We're going to stick with substances for right now. The negative impact most negatively affects Black and Brown people, Black, Latinx, Asian, Indigenous, so on and so forth. So that can look like the resources that they have, the places that they could be referred, the reaction that they will get if they are referred to a substance use facility, or if law enforcement is called to deal with the situation that's involving, a substance and or sex work. So we want to make sure that we're not only reducing the harm and the negative impact of the substance use, but all the other things that come attached with being someone who uses substances or being someone who partakes in sex work. So we want to make sure that the person is safe internally and externally.
Thank you for that.
I think to add to that, it's like, really like harm reduction is diversity, equity, and inclusion work. Like that is what it is. This is equity work, right? The idea of harm reduction, especially in the context of people who are experiencing houselessness, right? Like this is in and of itself diversity, equity, and inclusion. We're helping provide, or we're helping kind of, encourage equity for different folks, right? Like I like to drink. I have a place where I can go inside and drink and not be exposed to potential harms because it's physically safe. The police aren't going to see me. I'm not going to get a ticket, right? But like some of our clients don't have those same, luxuries. And so by me practicing harm reduction, and I like to, if you've seen any of the other times that I've like spouted off about harm reduction, I don't think about it as like something I'm doing to the client because I do it with my friends, I do it with myself, right? But like when we're doing, when we're engaging in harm reduction with a client, let's say, right, this in and of itself is equity work, right? Because just because I have a place to go doesn't mean that like I should be able to enjoy my glass of wine more than my client who doesn't have a place to go to have that same luxury, right? And so I think there's a huge intersection between DEI and harm reduction. I think that truly like harm reduction is DEI work.
Excellent. I think that really answered our second question as well. So I'm going to jump into the next question.
Well, before we skip over that one, because I think there is a little nuance here, which is, so the second question was supposed to be about like, and I think it kind of goes both ways. Like in my mind, it goes both ways, right? Like there's a, harm reduction and doing harm reduction with the DEI lens or DEI focus, kind of what Bowie was talking about, is really important, right? Because like, if I'm doing harm reduction, I have to understand that the consequences for maybe my Black client are going to be different when the police are called than my white client, or, maybe like someone who's not experiencing homelessness, right? So there's like a piece where you need to have a DEI lens kind of to the harm reduction work. But then the other direction for me also is that harm reduction really like furthers DEI, and it creates a more equitable like situation. I guess it's kind of like what I was already saying, but like I really do think that it's a two-way street, right? Like it is harm reduction is DEI, and like on the surface we need to like practice DEI when we're thinking about harm reduction topics, but then it furthers, kind of globally, like, and within our society, like a broader movement toward equity, right? Because we know that the reason that people are experiencing like houselessness or experiencing like all of these things, a lot of the reasons like maybe why people even choose to use relate to trauma, and that trauma is perpetuated by inequality. And so like there's an even like deeper kind of way in which like practicing harm reduction can improve equity on a societal level, and then maybe help to improve kind of some of the situations that we're seeing.
I think that we need to be culturally considerate. And I think that also in my case, at times, I need to look at my own countertransference in these areas.
All right, thank you both. So I'll get into the next question, and that's, what are ways that staff and our programs can ensure they're practicing harm reduction and DEI? So let's take the first one, like interactions with clients that are different than us.
Inclusive signage, a welcome environment, open door policy, walk-ins welcome.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are all really great examples. I think also when we're thinking about like harm reduction and DEI, really thinking about the ways that different situations clients are going to experience them is different from how we're going to experience them. So I think Roy gave some really great examples of how we can actively do this within our programs, but then also understanding how our clients are going to be treated, kind of like what Bowie was saying in the beginning, is like how they're going to be treated differently in the world, maybe differently than us. And especially if we have maybe different identities, or, they're different than us, or even just in and of itself, the fact that they're experiencing homelessness, right? Like my experience at the DMV might be very, very different from my client who's experiencing homelessness. And how can we reduce some of the harm that might come to them and their mental health personally, by having that potentially traumatic experience, right? And so understanding those things and incorporating that, being really mindful of that in the way that we work with the clients, in an empowering way, not to say like, not to like pathologize the situation, but to encourage and support and give tools and prepare clients for situations that they might run into, right? Like going to the doctor might be very different from me than it is for a client with different identities. And so how can I prepare my client for the best possible experience? Does it mean that I go and advocate for the client if that's what they want? Like how can I be responsive to the harms that might come, because the harms that they experience aren't necessarily the same harms that I would experience from the same situations.
Erica, that's such a wonderful point. How many times do we as providers step back and think, oh, this person will probably have a very different experience than myself or someone else, and just stepping back and being mindful and even thinking of that. That's a really good point. Bowie, were you going to say something?
I know also that understanding that clients are the experts on their lives. Oftentimes as providers, or, we work for an agency, we feel as though we know this, and we don't. And so that could really look like, if someone does come from a different background than we do, doing our research. And no, you cannot generalize an entire population of people, but you can have a more understanding of their culture, and then you're going to individuate. So then I'm going to ask questions, and not questions that I could research, but like questions that are particular to that person. If, you know, their response to a question is like, okay, and you don't really understand, tell me a little bit more about that, so that we have more aware of who our clients are. And then also, as far as the harm reduction, there's also a power dynamic when we're interacting with clients, regardless of what background that we come from. The power dynamic comes from our position of authority. That's how we're viewed. So sometimes conversations around harm reduction is going to look like us initiating that conversation, because oftentimes when we're dealing with the particular population that we work, unsheltered clients, their interactions with providers have not been great, and it's been very judgy. So if someone is coming to you and stating that, you know, I am using this substance, or I am a sex worker, okay, being non-judgmental, how can we make sure that you are safer? Because no one can actually be safe, but how can we make sure you are safer in these instances? So if that's teaching you, you know, how to use a Narcan bag, and to making sure you are around trusted people while you are using, because Narcan bags don't work if everybody's getting high at the same time. So you're going to need to take turns with each other to make sure if someone is having negative side effects from the drug, someone can administer the Narcan and call emergency services if that's what you choose to do. If you are participating in sex work, is there someone that you can partner with? What are safer locations for you to be? So on and so forth. So making sure, I feel like our interactions with clients shouldn't just be interactions, whether we have similar or different backgrounds, but it's definitely about collaborating with the client instead of us thinking we know what's best for them. I think, Erica, you've used a term before, it's very paternalistic. Yes, yes, not doing that.
All right, thanks, Bowie. Okay, so next question is, what are ways to ensure our service delivery is equitable?
I think that there's a lot of ways that, you know, we do this day in and day out with all of our clients in a multitude of ways. I think we're talking specifically about harm reduction in this panel. And so I think that when you're overlaying those two things, I think it is really important to like be really aware of your own bias, your own judgment,
Right.
when making decisions, especially when it relates to harm reduction related topics. Like, you know, when you find a client using in the bathroom, is there going to be a similar outcome to all clients? Is there going to be an equitable solution, right, that's applied, because we understand that people are different? Is it, you know, so I think that I think that this is an important thing to kind of layer on to what we're already doing related to providing services that are equitable. So, you know, like we do it all the time with all sorts of services, just like making sure that we're reinforcing that in our harm reduction practices as well.
So what are some ways that we can be mindful of our own judgments and opinions?
I know for me, sort of kind of circle this question and circling back to the next question, discharge around harm reduction and having a DEI lens, like, and so our own judgments when it comes to what are our judgments and our bias around sex work? What are our judgment and bias around certain substances? Because if we bring it back to the beginning of like how, you know, laws were put into place where it can be the same substance, but the way that it's presented, someone is going to get a longer jail sentence, and that longer jail sentence usually more negatively impact Black and Latinx people. So what is your judgment or your bias between crack and cocaine, weed and cocaine, heroin, meth? So the clients for me, there's no substance that is greater than the other. More so, how is it more negatively impacting your life as an individual? And where can I come in and where can I assist you? And making sure that, you know, the discharges are equitable and we are taking, culture into consideration. Yeah, I'll use myself for example. Obviously, or maybe not obviously, I'm Black. A part of my culture is speaking with my hands. Now, we know that when someone is drinking alcohol, usually their behaviors are a little bit more exaggerated. So if I was to become upset and I'm under the influence and I'm talking with my hands and I'm loud, are you going to be more afraid of me because of other preconceived notions than you would be with a client that is a white woman that's having the same behaviors while they're under the influence? And are you more apt to discharge that person? If that is a bias, okay. And the thing is, everyone has bias. If someone say they don't have bias, you're lying. Everyone has bias. So you have to be aware of them and you have to be willing to unlearn them and then be like, oh, okay, this is very similar, but I'm having a very different reaction. And there's really no real concrete or objective reason for me to have a different reaction. So making sure we're taking all of that into consideration when we're thinking about discharges, harm reduction, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Roy?
I think my interaction at first should just be listening, especially with people that are different from me. I'm here and somebody comes in and there's something that I'm not familiar with, or maybe I should just listen. And if I really don't have an answer, maybe I could chime one of my teammates in that have been through, that is the person's color or knows that culture a little bit better. But, passing judgment shouldn't happen, but it does. I should just listen at first.
I think one of the other things, this question originally is what are the ways that the staff and the program can ensure that they're practicing this? And so specifically with being mindful of opinions and judgments, I think there's tons of judgment around substance use, around sex work, around these different behaviors. And so I think it's really important that you start now to assess yourself on what you're carrying around. And it, like Bowie said, I mean, it's normal to have these biases, right? Like we all do. It's just that we need to be really aware of them, conscious of them, and keep them in check, right? Understand who we are and what we're bringing to the table, and then figure out how we can remove them so that we can work effectively with our clients. I think a lot of times, not to accuse people, but I think sometimes we don't think about these situations until we're in them, right? Like you don't really think about you're like, oh yeah, I'm good with drug users. And then, it's not until someone is on your, sitting in the chair in front of you, really, really high that oh man, maybe I have some bias, right? So there has to be that evaluation, that assessment now, start thinking about that. If a client comes up to you, you're like, oh yeah, I'm good with sex work. And then the first time a client's like, well, actually, I traded sex for, drugs last night on, out in front of Cloverfield, right? Your jaw drops and you have this visible reaction, right? That's not the time to process what your judgments are. That's not the moment to figure out where you stand on these things. I think it's important that we think about it now and get really honest with ourselves. And if you're uncomfortable, I would encourage any staff member, be really honest with yourself about it. Be honest with your supervisors about it. I'm always open and willing to talk to any staff if they have any questions or want to talk these things out. I'm, happy to make myself available, but I think that really figuring it out and how you're going to react in those situations in advance is really important.
All right, thank you, Erica. All right, so next question is about how operating in different environments may impact harm reduction and DEI service delivery.
I'll start. I'm thinking about, because obviously I work in interim housing shelter. So when you're working in interim housing, yes, the person is inside. It's not the ideal housing that they would want to have, but you are inside, you're sheltered from elements, you are not visible. However, because it's a community space and a therapeutic environment, you still can't use inside of interim housing. So the harm reduction is basically, we're aware that you use, let's help you with making this safety plan, but also, substances aren't allowed on site and you cannot use on site. So an alternative, if that's what you even want to call it, around for harm reduction is we have amnesty lockers. So the amnesty lockers, you put whatever you have in there before you come in, and then when you leave, you can take it with you, because people are going to, possibly use substances. They may need a weapon to be safe on the street, so on and so forth. So that's a sort of how we practice harm reduction when it comes to interim housing site. It's like, you can't use on site, but I can help you with the safety plan or a wraparound plan if you are going to choose to use offsite. And there are these amnesty lockers that you can use. So it looks different for us in interim housing. So it's like you're sheltered, but there's still some guidelines and responsibilities around, your choices and what you choose to do.
I think, when we were having kind of our preliminary conversation, we were also talking a little bit about how like this might vary from like maybe the west side to the downtown area, how things, like these environments that our clients are in are going to be very different. And I think when we're thinking about harm reduction specifically with regard to DEI, yeah, there's a lot of considerations that we have to think about, right? Like a client that goes out on Cloverfield Boulevard with a six-pack, maybe, is going to get a ticket, right? Whereas in Skid Row, maybe it's not even a thing that, a cop's going to look at, right? Maybe we talk in harm reduction about like, okay, so if you have a client that likes to drink, for example, thinking about ways to like reduce the harm and potential of getting a ticket or arrested. So maybe, you might want to switch to something smaller, a flask or a water bottle that you can conceal versus like a whole, case of beer, which is very hard to hide. On the flip side, right, like the beer maybe is going to be a better choice for some clients because like the liquor's too strong, and like, there's all sorts of considerations to take into account, which is, I think, what like the main theme of this panel is like all the clients are different. So we need to find out an individual solution. But I think that as we're also like thinking about those solutions, like for this client that likes to drink, we might jump to, okay, well, it's better to do beer instead of liquor because they don't get drunk as fast. It's not going to be as detrimental, blah, blah, blah. But then we also have to keep in mind this DEI aspect, which might be, where is this happening? Is it happening in a place where the client can drink a 40 on the street? Or is it happening somewhere where, they're going to be quick to arrest that client for that same behavior? And so I think environment is really important when you're thinking about the intersection specifically of DEI and harm reduction.
That's a great point, Erica. All right, anybody else before we move on to the last question? All right, so let's close it off with, let's see, practicing harm reduction and DEI with interactions with law enforcement and policing.
I mean, I think we've all kind of like touched on this in many ways throughout this conversation. I mean, I think it's also important to think about police interaction as a harm reduction topic in and of itself, right? Like we think about like the substance use or the sex work or whatever might get the cops called, but the act of interacting with the police is something to have some harm reduction conversations around, because those situations in and of themselves are inherently dangerous. and particularly dangerous for Black people and for people of color. And so I do think that it's important that our staff, so when we're thinking about like how staff and programs can ensure that we're practicing harm reduction in DEI is, yeah, being really honest about those things. Again, like I said, being honest about those things and really preparing ourselves now. I know that it's also important to have these conversations. I've worked with colleagues that were very uncomfortable whenever the police were called to a site. And so maybe it means that we're designating within a shift someone who's going to go out there and talk to the police or be the first face that the police talk to. Where are we going to physically place our bodies? Like when the police are called, how close are we going to stand? How are we bearing witness for our clients and for our other team members as well? And I think these are all important aspects of harm reduction that we should be starting to think about now and talking about now when we're not in the heat of the moment, so that we're prepared for when these situations arise.
Same as Erica, for me, DEI and harm reduction is not calling law enforcement. So however we can mitigate that situation without calling law enforcement, that's how, that is always my first approach. Now, if it's something that involves client on client and one of the other clients would like to call the police, of course, I can't be like, don't call the police. But to Erica's point, make sure that there's someone there to, mitigate the risk of, the client interacting with law enforcement and then, someone possibly being high on a substance. So trying to advocate, then also, staff keeping themselves safe and feeling safer and feeling comfortable in that situation, because, interacting with law enforcement is not comfortable. And I can say personally, it is not comfortable for me, but I know professionally sometimes it is something that I have to do and, to work up the nerve to do it. So to Erica's point, when you are calling law enforcement, it's a lot of game plan that goes into it to make sure that, everyone walks away.
Thank you for that, Bowie.
Well, I work downtown and I work in a permanent supportive housing unit. And the police get called all the time. But we do have a rapport with the property management and the security when they do call the police, that we go to we go with our client. We go downstairs and support our client and make sure that our clients are treated fairly. And we talk to the client, coach the client about being aggressive, putting their hands in their pockets, loud conversations, because we understand that some police can be biased and, and the area. So they're coming to arrest first. So we just try to put out the fire and support our client. And we've done well in that area sometimes, just, so.
Yeah, I think Ray brings up a really good point in like that. I also think that it's important that we own the scene. Like when the police are called or they're going to be entering one of our facilities, we are a harm reduction agency. And, I'm sure I'm not the only one that's witnessed the police do something not great in one of our facilities or with one of our clients. And having a plan and having the ability to know how to, what are the rights of the client, what are the rights of us as the stewards of the agency and the agency's facilities, how can we, advocate for our clients in the moment, right? It's even things like, when someone is ODing and we know it's drugs, when we make the call, not saying, hey, it's drugs, they're ODing, right? But saying like they're having difficulty breathing, you need to send an ambulance as opposed to law enforcement, right? So I think like that's also a really important practice when it comes to harm reduction and DEI is like thinking about how to own the scene, what are the rights, how are we, like just like Roy is saying, like, what can we do? And like I was saying earlier, identifying the people that are comfortable playing those roles in those situations. Because not everyone is, and it certainly is, we certainly don't want to endanger any of our staff or any of our clients in those potentially very dangerous.
Another piece is if we do know that law enforcement is showing up, letting everyone in the vicinity know that law enforcement is showing up. So if you want to get out of Dodge, you know, you have that warning. When law enforcement does come, they have to stay outside. So they're not coming inside of the shelter. Very, very, very rare that happens. And then also, man, I lost my train of thought. But, you know, definitely making sure people are aware that law enforcement is coming. Oh, and then debriefing afterwards. How are y'all feeling? Because it is like very traumatic for, you know, clients, people in general, when, you know, law enforcement shows up. So providing that space to debrief. And, you know, maybe you don't want to talk about it right now, but if you want to talk about it later or 2 or 3 days from now, you know, find someone to come and speak with. And depending on the nature of the situation, maybe reaching out to, you know, now at interim clinicians who are assigned to our shelter. So reaching out to, you know, the clinical team. So like, hey, you know, maybe possibly clients would want to speak to a clinician about this, but, you know, for the most part, clients will just come and speak to their assigned case manager because that rapport is already there. So I think that's very important too. Like, it's definitely from beginning to end after, you know, law enforcement does show up.
Yeah, so it sounds like the best approach is having a plan in place, being proactive, making sure everyone knows what the deal is and who's doing what. And then I like, Bowie, to your point, having a debrief afterwards. There any other comments on this before we wrap it up? Going once? Oh,
I would just say also debriefing with staff. The staff had to do the interaction as well. So making sure we're providing that support for clients, but also the staff that had to interact and or advocate.
definitely.
Yeah, I think just to close it out, I mean, I think it's just important to remember that, like we said in the outset, that harm reduction is DEI work. It's not like, you know, oh, this is the new topic. Like when you're doing DEI, you're doing harm reduction. So just remembering that. So yeah, we're just encouraging you to, I think, like further that, right? Be really conscious of it, but you know, that all of you that are doing harm reduction work are doing DEI work, and that's important.
All right, thanks for bringing us home, Erica. So thank you, Erica, Bowie, Roy. Thank you for joining us. This concludes another Q&A panel edition. Take care.